Welcome to today's live web discussion presented by Lucy Electric, a leader in secondary power distribution solutions specializing in high-performance medium voltage switchgear for utility, industrial, and commercial applications. I'm Nicolette Pomba-van Zyl, editor of ESI Africa and moderator for today's discussion, which will unpack the value of data to the multiple user groups within the utility, as well as exploring possible network architectures for managing control and analytical needs. Your presenters for today are Philip Dingle, Marketing Director, and Phil Evans, the Product Manager for Energy Services and Grid Key. Philip Dingle has over 30 years experience in the electrical sector and 15 years in the utilities arena, and has a deep knowledge of low voltage and medium voltage solutions. Phil Evans has 20 years experience in the electricity sector, having held business development, sales strategy development roles, primarily around power station solutions and energy services. Phil's background is in energy storage, fuel cell technology, and e-mobility, and he has a PhD in materials chemistry. If you have any questions during the discussion, please type them into the Q&A box on the left-hand side of your screen. They will be considered for live response from Phil and Philip. To start off the presentation, I'm handing you over to Philip.
Okay, good afternoon all, and welcome to this webinar from Lucy Electric. Interesting topic today in terms of data and how that impacts and links into what we're seeing as the control and SCADA architecture that is evolving within the utility network, but also the developing view, capture, use and data within the networks. And through the course of the webinar, we're going to take you through some elements of views on where we are in the network with this, and actually some real case examples and some innovation projects that we're involved in at the end of the session. So moving on and getting into some of the meat of the presentation. What's the context for this? Why the interest in data? And we're going to take you through a few slides. Phil's going to run on the next one shortly. But the clear message is that the world of energy is changing. It's moving, it's evolving. We're asking different things of it now. The traditional network is no longer fit for purpose. We're seeing customers that are placing different demands, differing approaches to how they want to use and interact with the network. Add into that all of the climate change, and the whole view, the whole market is changing. And what we're trying to do here is untangle what does that mean for us, what does it mean for utilities as customers, and others that are now starting to engage in the utility space now that's changing. So that's the gist of where we're going to kick off. So I'll hand over to Phil now for the next piece.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So we've introduced the changes taking place within the energy sector, but what factors and market dynamics are having an impact on our traditional markets? So if we look at the particular diagram that we've got, going around this diagram from left to right, starting with climate change, in late 2015, at the Paris Climate Conference COP21, 195 countries adopted the first ever universal legal binding climate deal. The agreement sets out a global action plan to put the world on track to avoid dangerous climate change by limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees C, and that's above the pre-industrial levels. However, in June last year, President Trump announced that the US is withdrawing from the 2015 agreement. He characterized the agreement as a deal that's aimed to hobble, disadvantage, and impoverish the US. The world responded with criticism regarding this decision, with the United Nations spokeswoman saying it was a major disappointment for global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote global security. With regard to energy access, around the world it is estimated that somewhere between 1.1 and 1.3 billion people lack access to energy. Sub-Saharan Africa has around 13% of the world's population, 63% of which have no access to electricity. That's over 600 million people, equating to something like 38 of the 49 sub-Saharan countries where people live without energy. It doesn't matter what metric is used. Energy access, installed capacity, or overall consumption, sub-Saharan Africa is in desperate need of electricity. Indeed, the only other region globally with similar access rate is India, where 300 million people don't have access. 6 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies over the past decade have been in sub-Saharan Africa. However, sustaining such growth will only be possible if it is supported by a much larger and better performing energy sector. In 2015, the UN General Assembly adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and a set of 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which includes a dedicated and standalone goal on energy. As a result of falling costs, the growth in renewables over the last 10 years has been significant, accounting for 2/3 of new power added to the world's grid last year. At the end of 2016, more than 24% of global electricity was produced by renewables, dominated by wind and hydro and solar. Renewable energy sources are set to represent almost 3/4 of the 10.2 trillion the world will invest in new power generation technology between now and 2040. And according to Reuters, South Africa relies on coal power for more than 80% of its electricity generation, while renewables only contribute 7%. However, in April this year, South Africa signed a long-delayed renewable energy contract worth $4.7 billion with independent power producers, the first major investment deal under the new president. So if we now move on to disruptive technologies, utility companies are generally slow in responding to market trends, and disruptive technologies in particular. However, the growth in these technologies such as electric vehicles, energy storage and microgrids is having a huge impact on the way utilities are having to adapt to change. For example, by whichever measure one chooses, the market for battery energy storage solutions is expected to grow exponentially. Bloomberg New Energy Finance forecasts that the global storage market will double 6 times between 2016 and 2023. This growth follows a similar trajectory enjoyed by the solar industry between 2000 and 2015, and this has been mainly driven by a reduction in the cost of the technology. With the introduction of distributed generation, renewable sources, energy storage and microgrids, the classic utility distribution network operator model is transitioning. These technologies have a significant impact on the design, operation, maintenance and improvements of distribution networks globally. The network operator or utility is having to transition to becoming a system operator, but the industry lacks consensus on what the role really entails, with a number of the network operators promoting slightly different future business models. Typically, they need to extend their role to manage all distributed energy resources below the transmission distribution boundary. The distribution system operator would then respond to instructions from the grid system operator and manage the distributed energy resources to best meet these instructions. The distribution system operator would also have to facilitate an ancillary service market for these technologies. And finally on this slide, customer preferences and expectations are shifting towards fewer carbon emissions, greater choice, real-time interaction and sharing, always-on connection, higher transparency, services more than products, and better reliability and security. As a result of these changes, the utility sector will have to acknowledge the new reality of a digital and customer-empowered electricity system by embracing new business models while redesigning the experience of residential, commercial and industrial customers. So if we look at the next slide, the drivers for change. We've talked now about some of the market changes transforming the electricity sector and outlined some of the key drivers responsible for this change. but there are three key themes that are shaping the future of our industry, namely decarbonisation, decentralisation and digitisation. So starting with decarbonisation, a new report reveals that 2017 was a record year for renewable power installations, and anybody that's interested in that report can read it in the REN21 Renewables 2018 Global Status Report. The latest report was published last Sunday and claims that renewable projects accounted for 70% of all new power additions last year, representing nearly 180 gigawatts of increased capacity worldwide. Another encouraging finding was the investment in new renewable power capacity last year was more than double that of new fossil fuel and nuclear power capacity combined, a trend the report attributes to falling renewable prices. Solar accounted for nearly 55% of newly installed renewable power capacity in 2017, with wind and hydro accounting for 29% and 11% respectively. As the energy sector transitions to more renewables, the network is becoming more decentralised with the introduction of wind, PV, other forms of microgeneration, as well as significant amounts of energy storage. This, of course, is driving the network operator to system operator debate, as we discussed earlier. However, as the network becomes more decentralised, a greater level of visibility of its performance is needed for both real-time operation and future planning. Digitisation of the power sector has already begun, with blockchain and smart meters becoming commonplace and virtual power plants replacing traditional. So now if we move on to the next slide, and this is all about utility performance and service levels. We've discussed the external factors already, which is the left-hand side of this slide, so I won't go through those in any more detail. Of course, the challenge we've got is always made much greater due to the uncertainty around the scale of technology that we've been introduced by the adoption of our customers and how to support the global objectives of reducing greenhouse gases. As a result, in order to provide excellent levels of network performance and customer service, utilities are required to deliver the following outputs. These are the outputs on the right-hand side of this graphic. This is generic for the UK, but is equally applicable to other markets, but may vary slightly depending upon immediate priorities. I'm not going to go through each in detail, but some thoughts and comments are as follows. Safety, this is at the top of the list, and this is always at the centre of everything we as a utility should be doing. Substations that are being targeted by vandals or thieves can present serious risk to members of the public, contractors or our staff, and the removal or destruction of electricity equipment by copper thieves also leads to the loss of power to customers. Social obligations. Utilities are having to deal with vulnerable customers on a day-to-day basis. And just looking at Eskom, for instance, they're committed to keeping the lights on in homes, schools, hospitals and businesses across the country. But as a result of this energy transformation, this is becoming more challenging as the network becomes decentralised and visibility of performance decreases. And that moves us nicely onto reliability and availability. Greater visibility of the network is required to ensure the utility has a better understanding of the impact of the transition on the condition of the assets. Utilities have key targets to restore customers as quickly as possible, or face, of course, significant penalties. Key indices are used to compare the performance of utilities, and outside Europe, SAIFI, that's the System Average Interruption Frequency Index, and SAIDI, System Average Interruption Duration Index, are used. Here in Europe, we use a slightly different convention. Instead of referring to SAIDI, we refer to CML, Customer Minutes Lost, and SAIFI as Customer Interruptions. And if we just look at one of the UK distribution companies, for instance, they have a CML of 30.4 and a CI of 38.7. And this means, on average, a customer connected to the network will be off supply for just half an hour per year, or where customers are interrupted, on average, only once every 18 months. And this is a real drive that the DNOs here in the UK have got, is to significantly improve on previous years.
Okay, so having set the scene with a view of the marketplace, let's now start looking at some of the details. We're showing here a graphic of a traditional made-up network to illustrate where we operate within the secondary distribution. And in this example, we're showing a number of ring main units, overhead switches that are carrying out their role within the network. But at this point, the network from the primary substation down is completely done. There is no automation, no monitoring. It's basic switchgear that has been connected, and the only means of operation is physical interaction with the switchgear. So firstly, in the event of a fault, it requires an engineer to get in a van, whatever means of transport, to find the switchgear, to then go through a procedure to reconnect to the customers. So from a SAIDI, as Phil's just said, that is a very long-winded process, and any penalties linked to the disconnection of customers are considerable. But it also means that that whole of that network, there is no information on the load flows, who's doing what, anything about. And that, as we'll see, is now becoming a problem as we move into this more complex world. So if I move on to the next slide, what we're starting to see in many markets is the adoption of automation at various points in the network to improve the performance of the network. Significant reduction in SAIDI and SAIFI, and by that we're putting in RTUs connected to a SCADA system where the utility control room can now manage the network through the scheme. Now, that's fine. The issue here at the moment is that the availability of that automation varies widely around the world. And in many other markets, we're seeing huge variances. So, for example, if I again was to take the example of UKPN, which manages London, then their current automation of the network, medium voltage network, sits at around 65%. If we look at the Middle East and we think of Dubai and the major cities in Saudi Arabia, it's at 0. If we think of Bangkok, they are just starting. They're putting in their first stage RTUs now. They've just done a proof of concept design. So the market that we operate is at different stages, different levels of transition, wrestling with how to implement this change in a cost-effective way that gives them not only the ability to manage the network, but the flexibility for future changes, developments on what we're seeing. And the final piece that we've added into this diagram is the little box over on the right-hand side, which looks very uninteresting, but that's actually the monitoring unit, for which you'll see some of the information later on. So a lot of change going on in the network, and much, much more to come as many of our customers wrestle with how they set up the control network, let alone the data, the network for managing the data. So if we move on to the next slide.
So we've talked about the challenges and key drivers impacting the traditional utility business model. As the use of data and data analytics becomes increasingly important for both network monitoring and control, one of the biggest challenges faced by companies when planning the infrastructure required to collect and process this, and I was going to call it big data, but actually a lot of people are now calling it colossal data, is the complexity of the solution required. This slide gives a high-level overview of the architecture necessary for sensors and devices, first of all to communicate with each other and with cloud services and applications to ensure that the value of the data is realized. The left-hand side, and so that's the first 4 arrows effectively, this is the sensors, connected devices, edge platform and communication edge. And this represents what people call the grid edge. These technologies can be categorized into 4 categories: physical infrastructure assets like ring main units, RTUs, data concentrators. And then we have network or control applications and analytics. The edge platform, or edge computing and analytics, is where data is processed near the source in sensors, controllers, machines, and gateways. These systems may not send all data back to the cloud, but the data can be used to inform local machine behaviours as it is filtered and integrated. The edge systems may decide what data gets sent, where it gets sent to, and when. Placing intelligence at the grid edge helps address problems often encountered in industrial settings such as oil rigs, mines, chemical plants, factories, and of course our own distribution network. These generally include low bandwidth, high latency, that's network delays, and the perceived need to keep mission critical data on site to protect IP. The middle section of this chart represents the infrastructure, and this is often provided as a service for hosting space and processing power for both applications and services. Some companies that sell connected devices are already building their own proprietary software back-end solutions, and these include the likes of ABB, Schneider, and Siemens, who recently launched their MindSphere. Finally, dedicated applications to support your own or customer businesses are required to drive analytics and insights throughout the value chain.
So, if we now take the next level of detail coming down, we see in the middle there that the graphic that Phil's just looked at, and what we're picking up now is the differences here between the SCADA RTU control network and the cloud-based data monitoring side. So clearly the left-hand side with the control, the SCADA, is very much sitting on the edge, but is consistent with the theme of enabling cybersecurity, enabling as much control and functionality being done at the local level. And this is very much what we see in everything that we touch now, how to put control down to the local level. The key thing to highlight here is that also supports cybersecurity, which is critical in terms of the SCADA, the control side, and in terms of the functionality. Whereas the right-hand side is now moving into the cloud, the acquisition of data for which the cloud is ideally suited in terms of being able to position all of the information and creating the opportunity for access to the information in terms of whichever way we want to look at that. And I think there is so much that we deal with in life where access to information, what we're doing with it, we are continuing to learn and see more of that every day. The challenge for us when we look at this is that a lot of the utilities, the companies that we engage with are very much focused on creating the left-hand side, which is the SCADA, the control, the critical infrastructure piece, and then they are thinking that the data piece can be added on to the side. And there's some very harsh lessons to be learned from that in terms of, A, the volume of data that the network requires if you're going to push all the data through. And in early versions where the bandwidth wasn't good enough, we've actually crashed SCADA systems because of what people are trying to put through. But it's also making the distinction between what do you need in terms of your immediacy for making control decisions versus what do you actually needing from a data gathering point of view and a future flexibility in terms of gathering the data. So the key thing with this one is at the moment it's very much about understanding the end value of what's required from a control system versus the end value from a data point of view, and being very clear on those objectives up front rather than trying to do an add-on which ends up being a muddled solution at the end. Okay, so if we move on.
Okay, so as a result of greater levels of automation and monitoring, which Phil has just talked about, we're now starting to collect a significant amount of data that is suitable for mining and turning into actionable information. There is a danger, however, that utilities will fail to look at all aspects of this big data collectively and instead seek to implement individual point solutions to address specific issues. Organisations need to think strategically and work collaboratively to release this valued data in driving business outcomes. So where does the data journey begin? If we start on the left-hand side of the chart with the raw data, and the little images haven't quite come up properly, so apologies. Raw data from connected devices provides very little value to any organisation, as it needs to be contextualised, ordered into basic and actionable information. Data without context lacks meaning and purpose. This is data in its basic form. And if we consider the data journey as the steps required to write an award-winning novel, then the raw data is just a collection of random letters on a page, which is incoherent to us all. Moving on to basic information, this is data that has been analysed and processed into a human readable form, i.e. a graphical interface. However, although this is far more useful output than the raw data, it still doesn't directly inform a specific action. So going back to our award-winning novel again, we've now arranged the collection of random letters into sentences and paragraphs, and have even got as far as writing some of the pages. Things are starting to make sense. We now turn to actionable information. This is meaningful data. This is used for decision-making or problem-solving. The data is created by performing analytics on data sets, allowing us to gain a greater visibility and understanding of our networks. It's important to note that most organisations fail to look at all the aspects of this data collectively and instead seek to implement individual solutions as mentioned before. Organisations need to think strategically and work collaboratively to realise this data. So finally, the collection of random letters, sentences, paragraphs and pages has evolved into chapters, and finally a great novel has been produced.
So, let's move on now and look at some real examples of the value that we can extract from data. And at this point, we're looking at information that has been collected from a number of sources, monitoring locations in various countries that we're involved in. And I've picked a few here to illustrate what can be done by looking at the data. So this first one is the use of temperature as an indicator of what's going on in the network. So in this particular example, we're now somewhere in West Africa, and we have two secondary substations, i.e. the combination of the ring main unit, MV-LV transformer and an LV distribution panel as one sub-assembly. And there's two of these, 5 kilometers apart. And the graph on the left shows that the ambient temperature, and there's a sensor inside the monitoring unit that just captures this as a piece of information just to make sure that there are no major issues. And as you can see, in a West African environment, we're hitting ambient temperatures inside the enclosure of a bit over 50 degrees sometimes. Perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable. On the right-hand side, we're seeing a graph that's showing temperatures nearing 80 degrees and in some instances going past 80 degrees, which it shouldn't be doing. The graph below then looks in detail as to when this is occurring, and this is now where we start to see a problem. On the graph we're showing 3 lines. The blue is the mean temperature over the period of time. The red is a minimum, and the key one here is the green, which is the maximum temperature. And as you'll see here, we've hit just over 80 degrees C, but we're hitting it at 10 o'clock at night. Well, clearly at 10 o'clock at night, there is no solar gain related to this. So it has to be from energy within the substation. And in this particular instance, it's actually from, we believe, a loose connection in the LV panel that when it's under significant load at night, overheats and results in a fire. And unfortunately, that's actually what happened in this instance, that the substation caught fire and burnt down. Sadly, we didn't have the information and we weren't looking at it in the right way to be able to realize that this is actually the train of events that led up to the fire by going through and looking at the data. We learned that lesson afterwards, which is an unfortunate one for the utility and involved, and obviously ourselves, in terms of what we could have done to save time, money and disruption to customers. So a simple example of alarm information that can be made available to make preventative decisions. As we all know from an electrical engineering point of view, temperature is a great indicator where it's outside of the norm that something is going wrong. In the next example, we've got two here. So if I look at the left-hand side, we've picked up here an example of electricity theft. And this is from street lighting circuits in Thailand. So the graph at the bottom shows, you can just see at the very bottom there, a steady state greyish area, which under normal circumstances is the load on a street lighting circuit. You wouldn't expect to see it any different. It's either on or it's off, and it's a steady state of about 1800 watts. What you're seeing mostly through the middle of the graph is loads of variations of values hitting up to nearly 14 kilowatt. This is actually street vendors in Thailand tapping into the street lighting columns to run their stalls and then disappearing again. So very simple energy theft. The gap in the two columns there on the 17th of September is when a utility inspector went round to see what was going on. So again, in many markets, energy theft is a real issue. It's a question of whether the tools, the monitoring, can help actually reduce that, because ultimately somebody pays for all of this lost energy. And on the right-hand side, a completely different example, which is looking at a typical street in the UK in the northwest, and it's looking at a street that has a very high density of rooftop PV. And rooftop PV in the UK is limited to 4 kilowatt. And the utility carried out a study with our help to look at the impact on the local network of all of that solar generation. So the graph represents over a 3-month period, a monitoring point every hour for a 3-month period, and that's what you see in the graph. So clearly at night, when there's no PV generation and most people are doing something similar during the night, you see a very strong correlation of all the dots into one area during darkness. But the key two ones to highlight here are the actual largest demand over the 3-month period was 250 amps on a grey day, very little sunshine, lots of people at home doing something. The converse to that, on a completely different day, is now there's lots of sunshine, very few people at home doing things. So the net generation, i.e. what is still being used to run fridges, freezers, washing machines, whatever people are doing, that's still in the mix, but there is so much solar generation going on that that actual network turned into be a net generator of 50 amps onto the network. So this just illustrates the challenges from a utility point of view in terms of what are you planning for the future in terms of your capacity on the network. And as more and more renewables come onto the network at this local level, that challenge will only grow. And in those areas, those countries where you start to see EV coming on board, then that just muddies the water further. Okay. Finally, I just want to pick up on two innovation projects that we're involved in the UK, looking at the use of data in terms of influencing and understanding the future direction of the network. So the first project is called Electric Nation, and this is with Western Power Distribution, one of the utilities in the UK. And this is very much looking at trying to understand the impact of electric vehicles on the network, the use pattern of us as individuals, as consumers, the way in which the electric vehicles that are currently available on the network charge, and then the impact it has on the utility network. So at the moment, this is the largest study in the world with some over 700 people connected onto this survey. The key here is to understand the charging aspect of the various EVs. So I'm showing here 4 examples of cars that are now available on the UK market. So the charging at a residential level is limited to 7 kilowatts. And you can see here they all have a fairly similar profile, certainly at the front end, with a very strong ramp up from 0 to 7 kilowatts, flat-line-ish for the duration of the charge, and then a drop-off at some point to 0 when it's finished. Now, part of what the survey is doing is looking at the use of algorithms to understand how many of these EV chargers are being connected to the network, to then understand what headroom, what spare capacity there is on the network between the normal domestic load and the available capacity on either that LV feeder or that MV-LV transformer. So that's very much work in progress at the moment to understand that. But certainly from some of the information so far, there are very real concerns that certain areas, neighborhoods, streets will have real issues in terms of the available capacity on the network. So even at this early stage, we're already into having to make decisions between improving the capacity of the network, which is not good from a cost point of view because that means digging up roads and putting in additional cables, or using control techniques to smooth the charging of the vehicles over a longer period, i.e. through the night. So it's very much work in progress at the moment, and lots more can be found on that one on the Electric Nation website. The second project is OpenLV, and this very much links to the slide I was talking about earlier with the completely dumb network. If you think roughly in the UK there are 1 million LV distribution boards within the utility control that have no monitoring, no information. That's the feeder for all our homes and small businesses. The aim of this project is to understand if we were to start to connect these and to be able to build up the database of information about what's actually happening to the LV circuit, plus some information on the transformers, MV, etc., in much the same way as we have seen the explosion of data and apps with the mobile phone age, this is now very much about if all of this information on the LV network is available to those that have the creative mind for developing apps linked to the LV network, what could we do? And that's very much the spirit and the theme of this application. So if I go on to the next slide, that just shows you an architecture of how this is being put together. We've clearly there in the middle got the secondary substation, 11 kV, the monitoring, network automation LV feeder. That's very much the traditional piece in there. But importantly, the information is going into the cloud, enabling the analysis of that data, the opportunity to do something with that data. So, for example, one of the things that's already been put forward as a result of this is that at a local level, can you do peer-to-peer trading on the network of energy? Because I, as a PV generator in my house or my small business, I have excess energy I'd like to sell, and you as a business or a homeowner nearby would actually like to buy that energy. Well, if the network, the move to DSO in the UK will enable that actually to happen as a business model, but what it then needs is the knowledge and understanding from the network to actually be able to enable that as a connection, that to say, yes, there is the capacity in the network to enable that financial transaction to take place. So just one example, and there are many, many more that will come out of this. We're seeing another example highlighted here in terms of community trading, community purchase of energy. So the concept of, rather than us as individuals buying our energy from the utility, can you get a better deal by acting as your group of 20 houses, your village, and using your purchase power with the utility. So many, many more things to come, but it's very much around the ability to access that information. So finally, as a conclusion, just to wrap up on what we've gone through, we heard at the beginning from Phil lots about the changes that are taking place in the industry, and that to be able to respond in a proactive way, we need information. I mean, it's very difficult at the moment to be able to plan for what's coming. One of my favourite sayings is that at the moment my crystal ball is a little cloudy, and that, when asked many questions about this, is a challenge I think all of us feel when we're either trying to future gaze, plan for the network, or as manufacturers plan what we're going to be building and developing to respond to those challenges. Data, the use of those tools, is absolutely critical to understanding the whole evolution of the network and how we should influence those decisions. Finally, going back to the model in terms of raw data, basic information and actions, it's fine. Maybe a very nice academic exercise to collect information for use in a number of areas, but from a business point of view, unless we can link that information through to actual decisions and taking actions that generate value for our customers, our shareholders, ourselves as individuals, then there is no value in having that information available. There's no value in that data. And that really has to be the key message here, that we have to be able to get value from the data, or else we run the risk of drowning in it. Okay, so thank you very much. I'll now hand back to Nicolette.
Thank you very much for that informative presentation, Phil and Philip. We do have a few audience questions that I'd like to pose to you both. But before I do that, I'd like to just remind the audience that they can pose as many questions as they like, because if we run out of time, we will still have the conversation online on Twitter, as well as we will correspond with each person who has posed a question that we didn't have an opportunity to answer. And also, I'd just like to remind everyone that the presentation will be available to them on demand on our website. Going into our first question, which is from Kennedy in Kenya, who is asking, how can leading utility companies manage their networks more effectively where data and analytics is concerned, and specifically in rural areas? Philip, would you like to respond to that question?
Yeah. So I think that the first challenge there is you can only manage and access the data if you're putting the monitoring systems in place. So that's the first thing, is to plan where you want to capture the data from to make what decisions. And then, unfortunately, there is a real challenge between rural and the more urban areas, or in the cities such as Nairobi. The challenge with the rural areas is, first of all, are you talking about still grid connected, or are you now talking microgrid independent off-grid applications? And that brings a very different challenge. But the second one, then, looking at, you know, a lot of the rural areas of Africa, the acquisition of the data typically requires either radio or some form of mobile phone connection. So does that physically exist? So there's some pretty fundamental planning questions to address there first, before you then get into the decisions around how to better manage the network. But clearly, having spent time in East Africa, in Kenya, Tanzania, etc., then one of the issues is related to load shedding and the number of times people are disconnected. And that sadly is about getting a generation capacity and a network capacity local to where the customers are.
Right, and that is both planned and unplanned load shedding that we are aware of. So I have another, right, I have another audience question, and this is asking about digitalization, which comes with many benefits for both the utility and customers. But with your understanding of digitalization, what are the potential drawbacks?
Well, I think, yeah. I think you can take that question and go down two routes. So the first one, as in so much of what we're seeing in the news today, is the whole issue around cybersecurity, and clearly the maintenance of maintaining the network. Sorry, not maintenance. Maintaining the reliability of the network against any of the cybersecurity issues is absolutely critical. So that's very much a challenge in that, and that's why I was trying to make a distinction between the needs of the control, the edge side of the platform that we're referring to, and the cloud gathering. I think if you move into the cloud and the data gathering, then you're clearly into the protection of the data. But I think at this stage it's clear to point out that you're not looking at, you know, individual personal data. It's just about a lot of volume data on the network.
So this then brings me to a very interesting question, which I would have actually posed myself. And this comes from Rudo from International Rivers. And she's asking, what are the risks for one to completely go off the grid and rely on solar panels for electricity supply? Rudo's asking because she says, I am considering this in light of the ever-increasing ESCOM tariffs. Philip, would you like to respond?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of levels to that question. So firstly, it is perfectly technically feasible to operate on your own independent grid with solar. However, you then hit a number of practical problems, especially if you're moving into, you know, a number of houses or into a small village. Clearly, what do you do for energy at night? The only way of solving that is by use of energy storage, batteries, or by buying your own diesel genset. The difficulty with both of those solutions is that you're now incurring a significant capital cost, which you've got to then view against your cost of the tariffs from ESCOM. Now, that then changes you over to a different question, which was a key one during a number of discussions at African Utility Week in 2016, which is the very real challenge placed to the utilities in ESCOM, Esequeni, but many all over the world, is that as more generation becomes decentralized at a local residential community level, what is the role of the network, and how does the network recover the costs for putting that network in existence? Because it can no longer recover its costs based on a tariff of the energy that it's selling to you as a customer. There needs to be some other mechanism that says if you're buying energy, you're paying for something, but then another mechanism somehow that says actually you're paying for that backup network being in place to support you when it's dark, when you need excess demand. But clearly, from everybody else's point of view, that tariff has to be at a sensible level so that it actually discourages people to disconnect to the network. That makes no sense.
That's a very good point that you're making there. And this then brings me back to the question around data protection, because we have another audience member that is asking, in terms of the recent EU GDPR regulation and similar local policy in Africa, what is the impact for utilities then using this data in terms of general data protection? Phil, would you like to respond?
So GDPR is very much about personal data, our data, and particularly, you know, our records, our banking, whatever. From a utility point of view, the key data that they could get that would be linked to us would be to make publicly available the usage pattern of the smart, for example, our smart meter data. That to me would come under GDPR, because that, to unsubscribe, you know, to from a theft point of view or other, it gives you an opportunity to say, I can look at somebody's load profile and I can clearly see there's nobody at home during those points of the day. Where we're looking at data from a secondary point of view at the substation, we're more looking at the aggregated data on the network, not the specifics of that one end customer connection, which is what you would get from smart meter data.
I think that's very important for utilities to be aware of. And I'd just like to then ask you both to give me a brief overview of your feelings around what is next for the evolution of the network. We know what's happening now. We know what is disrupting the industry now and how we need to then accommodate that on the network. But what do you see after that? What is going to happen? Phil and Philip, would you please respond?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think we've seen high levels of automation at the transmission level, at the generation level, and that level of automation, as we've been talking about today, is coming much lower down into the network, down to the LV level. And I think what we'll see coming up over the coming years is much greater levels of control by the system operator, if you like, at that local level. And that interaction will be with customers, the domestic customers as well, because they obviously will play a big part in all of this as prosumers, i.e. generators and users of energy. So for me, I think that's interesting. I think the whole world of data, and we've talked about personal data, but also data from the substations, going to open up some really interesting applications. And we've talked about OpenLV and the whole possibility of developing specific apps to address particular issues or concerns or customer aspirations, if you like. And I think that's where the market's going. It's greater levels of automation, it's greater levels of control, and actually greater levels of things talking together. And one of the things we haven't talked about clearly is the Internet of Things, where lots of different devices and sensors all start coming together and talking. So that for me is where I think it's heading.
Okay. I'd throw in a slightly different one. And I think this is a very real challenge that is particularly relevant to more of the developed world, but even parts of the major cities in Africa where there's a lot of infrastructure that already exists. So the first challenge there is, as Phil said, how do you automate, put monitoring in? Well, we know how to do that. The difficulty comes when you start to say, through smarts, through the use of load leveling, etc., that you need to put in additional capacity. And that's when you start hitting some very severe numbers in terms of building that that additional capacity for increased load in the existing network, where digging up streets, roads, etc., is horrendously expensive. I think the opportunity for a lot of the areas that we've talked about in Africa and India and other markets, where it's building a new network that doesn't exist. It's actually having the forethought to build something that says, actually, this is a network that's flexible for the future and can easily accommodate many of the things we talked about. It's a harder one to sell and justify when you're writing out and signing off the CapEx, but if we look at so much of what we do, you know, whether it's our personal lives when we think of our phone purchases, our cars, etc., or as businesses, that's what we have to do now. We have to make ourselves flexible, adaptable for the future.
Right, thank you very much, Phil and Philip. That was such an interesting discussion, and I definitely look forward to hearing from the audience around what their thoughts are from this discussion going forward. We will now continue with a short Q&A session on Twitter with @LucyElectric immediately after we close this live session. Just a reminder again to the audience that a recorded version of today's discussion will be available on demand at www.esi-africa.com. And for more information on the discussion and around the solutions, please visit www.lucyelectric.com or email salesza@lucyelectric.com. Thank you so much for tuning in.